is that we're living in a time where we have human rights violations, right? We are all doing the work around that, and there's social, economic, climate and ecological injustice, development injustice, but also, as you know, in the Pacific region, and I think one of the things that we've got to be very clear about is that in terms of the world, we have in our region the highest per capita rates of violence against women and girls in the world. And that violence isn't just against women and girls, but it's also, you know, sexual abuse and all forms of violence against children, femme people, gender non-binary people, and LGBTQI. Anyone who's considered either to be sitting outside the norms, but also, as you know, a whole kind of half of the population is also touched by gender-based violence. And then not just the direct physical violence with rates of like 60 to 70%. And here in Fiji, we've done the first survey study of violence against lesbian, bisexual and transgender people here in Fiji. And that's sitting at around 84% of those who were surveyed have said that they've experienced gender-based violence. So there's the structural injustice and violence that is not just directly against the body, but it finds its way into the way that faith systems work or social systems work, the schools, the education system, the medical practitioners, all of those institutions are also implicated. And then around the world, what we've been seeing, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why we find ourselves here in 2021, but there's a lot of militarized, racist, and patriarchal populist leaders. You know, we've just had Trump, and he's out of power now in the US, but one change doesn't make a change in the entire system. And we've seen the rise of these male populist leaders, and we have to think about that. And the fact that they happen, that many of them are in the economic north, doesn't mean that there's no effect on us, because of course it has an effect on social, economic, and ecological and environmental policies. There's also some of them who have been rising in the economic south, as we know. So at the same time, you get a lot more of these self-identified feminist leaders. Jacinda Ardern, who came into New Zealand and who's the Prime Minister, was very clear that her platform she ran on was feminist and that she is a feminist Prime Minister. But you've also had those who, like the Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau, and Macron and others who've said that they are feminists. So what does it mean to say that you are a feminist leader of any gender? What does it mean? And are we comfortable when some of these leaders are saying that they're feminists when we look at their domestic and foreign policy? So that's important to look at that. So that's another reason to be clear on what we mean by feminism. But at the same time, as all of these dark things are happening, we also have this really wonderful, rising, very strategic, solidarious action. If you look at COP26, the climate change conference that happened just the last couple of weeks, in Scotland, you really would have seen the power of social movements, including the incredible 350 Pacific activists and many other activists from Pecan and from all around the world who are insisting that they are part of power, that they are part of movements, and that if we're going to change things, whether it's in the nation state or in societies, that we have to have strong leadership in all kinds of communities. That's really why we're putting forward this feminist set of community of practice, is because we have to have multiple kinds of leaders with multiple kinds of intelligence that are operating if we're going to deal with those darker ones that are about greed or that are about elitism or that are keeping poor people poor. So we've got to have a counter movement that helps us, you know, to really strategize together. That means climate movements, that means youth movements, women-led movements, feminist movements. So that's part of what we're doing. And one of the things that we have to say is there is progress, right? On gender justice and on development justice. We see all of these sets of work. We've just had Beijing plus 25. And every year we go to the Commission on the Status of Women and we ask ourselves, what's the progress that we've made in the last year? Sometimes we're happy and there's a whole lot of areas on which we're not, obviously, because it's about social justice and economic justice and ecological justice for everyone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Who are we talking about when we talk about feminism? And one of the things that we're determined to do through the next 15 months, what we've said is this is not about building a new network. We don't need another network. There's many networks. You are all part of them, many organizations. What we want to do is to have these communities of practice that very explicitly and deliberately take the time to do our thinking and our feeling and our acting together, so that when we're building our movement knowledge, that we're starting to get to a good place. So let me first move to the next definition and say the definition that we use at Diva for Equality is this, and I'm going to take a little bit of time. Remember, you're going to get this set of PowerPoints, so don't worry too much about taking notes. Just enjoy the next couple of hours. Feminism, really, what it is at heart is it's a belief system, a belief in the equality and human rights of everyone, the worth of everyone in the world. And that's regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their expression, the way they show themselves in the world, their sex characteristics, that's the sex characteristics that they're born with, their biology, regardless of what skin color they are, their ethnicity, their age, their disability, and any other intersectional identity and characteristics. If you're born in Laos, then you should be able to count on the reach of the state in Laos. You should be able to count on the reach of the state in West Papua. You should be able to count on the state wherever you are around the world. And we all know the contradictions in that, but this is about the ask of universality. If we make these claims, then we have to be clear that those claims are for everyone, not just those who are like us, but but everyone. So if we say that, then the next paragraph is very important, which is this is a decolonizing frame. The mess in which we find ourselves today around the world and the beauty is not coming just from today. One of our wonderful feminists from the economic south, from the Caribbean, Peggy Antrobus, says, always look backward as much as you look now and into the future. And we really want to do that, to say, how is it that we've come to a time where we're still seeing so much fossil fuel-based economies when we already know that that's where we need to be far from by now? Why is it that we find ourselves in a time when 90% of coral reefs are under threat? Why are we under such burden of debt in the majority South? It's because of bad choices being made on an economics basis, right? So it means that the response, if it's a feminist response, it has to be about the ideas, it has to be about the analysis, the framework or the basket in which we place those ideas. It has to be about our life praxis, the way that we wake up every day. Every choice that we make, feminists say, is a political choice. It's just about power. And it's about socio-political, economic, and ecological activism on an individual basis, and social organizing. So what are we organizing for? Well, this next sentence is some of the things that we have to focus on. Care. So that's care, the care economy, and we'll talk about that in future sessions that we come into. But really, when you look at the care burden, the unpaid care, domestic and communal work that is done by certain parts of the population is about 3 times what it is for the other part of the population. And you can tell which part of that we're talking about. If you look at your own families, you look at your own institutions, you know who's up the earliest in the morning and is the last one going to bed at night. So care, provisioning, justice, equity, and the last one, which stops us from just doing reform, is liberation on all territories. So we recognize, so one of the things that feminists say is we can't just willy-nilly work on all these things without knowing what it is we're trying to move away from, right? You know where you're going, but you have to know where you're moving away from. So we recognize that there's existing hetero-patriarchal, racist, imperialist, and radical neoliberal capitalist practices that really oppress us and that create inequalities in society. So feminism tries to work to break down, to really bring those to the light and to break them down. and to build new, more just systems on all territories. All of these things that we're doing are work in progress, right? And we're not saying it's easy. We're saying that if you look, 100 years ago, women didn't even have the vote. New Zealand was actually the first one in the early part of this century where women first got the vote. Look at the shift from there to now. That's a huge set of progress in 100 years. But there is so much pain, so much inequality within and between countries, and that's what we're interested in working to change as a social movement. So one of the visual ways, I'm a visual learner, probably like many of you, feminism is like removing cataracts from your eyes. So basically, but the problem with cataract operations, right, when you come out of them, it's a little bit painful. When you start to see things in a new way, you need healing time. You need to retrain your eyes and your brain, but it's worth it because of all the kind of brightness and detail and nuance that you walk through the world with. And yes, you do get angry. And yes, there are many things about the world that are difficult for you to do, but it's well worth it. Okay, and then the next thing, and the reason why I put it in this frame is some agreements, but really there's some of us who don't agree, right? So there are some feminists who would refuse to work with LGBTQI people. Unfortunately, there are some feminists who don't like to work around transgender people or gender non-binary people. So all of those are about almost agreements. We talk about universality of rights, but sometimes there are people who are not like us. There even are a lot of feminists who might be, say, white feminists, and they're not comfortable around brown or black feminists from the economic South, or what we call the majority South. But these are the things we don't want to talk about and talk to each other about as feminists, and we have to be able to do that. Personal is political, we say, and political is personal. The next thing we say is we have to honor multiple forms of knowledge. That means that it doesn't only matter whether you have a doctor before your name or some letters after it, whether you went to university. The knowledge that comes from the ground is incredibly important because those are the most connected to different kinds of work. Using an intergenerational approach is important, and that's another reason why I put the almost. Sometimes you get a lot of older feminists who are holding space within the movement, and they're not willing to let in emergent feminists into the space. And we're not the only ones who do it. So whenever anyone accuses the feminist movement, I always say that happens in all kinds of work. That happens in workplaces, that happens for elder children at home, right? There's all kinds of hierarchies, whether it's because of age or many other kinds of hierarchies. So we try to kind of hold that up to the light. And then we say, feminists, we work within our spaces. Like, for instance, many of us might work with governments, but we always do it with a critical eye. So whenever we go into the space, we're trying to do it, not just to talk to ourselves. In a space like this, it's learning. That's why it's closed, right? And we will put some of this up online for public, but there's a certain section of our discussion today that's not for public, where it's for us to just have a conversation about tactics, about strategies, about what's working and not working for us in the movement. So we have to differentiate about what we call above and below ground organizing. Not everything is about putting it into the public sphere, and that's one of the things that maybe we can challenge ourselves to do better. Sometimes some of us get caught up in capitalism and we start commodifying. So we brand everything, we put it into the public space, but really it might be something that we would be better to just keep to ourselves and discuss. So we've got to get better at that. Okay, and then the last one is that autonomous movements are not the same as consultancies. So they're not the same as funders. Even if it's a feminist fund, it's not the same as an autonomous organized women's group. And some of those differences we've also got to talk about in the movement so that we don't get caught in capitalist practice. And the last two are really important. One of them is about this idea of decolonizing our minds, our bodies, and our systems. Every day we have to work on that because all of us have that in our system. We live in a system that is colonized, that has been imperialist. You think about us in the Pacific, there are still many of those funding people who are from the old colonial powers. And we have to talk about how they influence our practices in the region.